The salmon are back. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Okay, I'm Marc Gauthier. I'm a wildlife biologist and filmmaker in Spokane, Washington. I'm here today with...
My name is Jeff Ferguson. I am a documentary filmmaker and photographer and Spokane tribal member. Now that the salmon are back, that's something that's revitalized the tradition and revitalizing the culture here. It's something that's really, it's something that elders have looked forward to for generations. It's something that we've needed in this area. Having the fish come back and available not only to the elders but also to everybody else in the community. It's been gone for so long, and it's just a whole part of this society that was taken away, that was no longer here for generations.
And that's what was amazing to me as a young guy. I assumed that all the elders would remember having salmon here. But what was kind of strange for me is, as I approached some of the Spokane elders, is that they themselves, who in their 70s and 80s, actually don't even remember the salmon being here. They've actually lived a whole life without salmon. So for me, that was kind of overwhelming to find that people within the tribe here who you thought were so tied to these fish actually have lost that connection, and now the fish are back. And so there are those elders that do remember, but then there's also elders that actually have no memory of the salmon, that are reconnecting to their culture based on these fish, and something that they had lost and didn't really realize how valuable it was until it came back.
Well, the salmon used to be such a huge part of the culture. There was about a 3-month period over every summer that you could fish the Spokane River and literally pull thousands and thousands and thousands of fish out, enough to feed everybody in the area and enough to stockpile for the winter. And with the huge fish, not just little fish, but huge fish, an average 30-pound salmon. 30 pounds was the average. So, and they got as big as 90 pounds. I mean, that's a huge fish. To be able to pull those out for 3 months solid and then just to totally lose that, I grew up wondering my whole life, why were... Everybody talks about salmon. What's the big deal about the salmon? We don't even have salmon in the Spokane River. Well, what's the deal? But then later I found out that they used to be here and that they were in abundance, and it was what sustained this area. It's what drew people here. People gathered here because of the fish, because the fishing was so good. That's really what built and made the Spokane Falls so important in this area. And to have that gone and then have it returned, that's just something else. It's amazing.
And the other thing that was fascinating about the Spokane tribe in this particular spot for catching salmon at the base of the Spokane Falls is that folks did come from all over the region. And you go to the mountains of Idaho that's lush and full of water, and today that's where we go to catch our fish. We don't come to the Spokane River or to Latah Creek to think about fishing, you know. But so it's kind of hard for us at this time and place to envision it. But people used to come from hundreds of miles from the mountains of Idaho, these lush places, to come to Spokane to get their fish, because this is where the salmon returned to. This was the closest point for them to touch the ocean and to touch this wonderful protein source, you know. So, you know, the fact that we have a village site here in Spokane that has been occupied for 8,000 years of people from all over the region coming to this one place to catch fish is remarkable. It's a one-of-a-kind place, and it just shows how valuable it was to this entire region, you know.
Yeah, it was a staple. It really was. The fish that came here from the ocean. You know, that's over a 1,000-mile swim. They got here, that was lean meat. That was good eating. And people came from everywhere to get that. And it was shared. It wasn't something, anybody that came and fished, they took home their fair share. As long as they contributed, they always divided up the fish equally among everybody that fished that day. And I thought that was great, because they didn't care where they came from. Everybody came from all over. As long as you put in a good day's work, everybody left with a lot of fish.
Here we are today, and we're just starting to taste the return of these fish. They're starting to come back in bigger and bigger numbers every year, and for the first time down in the Okanagan River this year, we had 300,000 sockeye return, which was the biggest sockeye run since the 60s at least. So since the major decline when all the dams were put in. So what happens when 300,000 fish return to a place that didn't have fish? I'll tell you what, it's incredible to see. You have elders that haven't talked in years meeting down at the dock and sitting around waiting for fish to show up so they can take their share home. And the dialogue that happens there, and the relationships that are built around fishing our solid relationships, and just the joy in the people's faces. It was something that I hadn't felt the whole time I'd lived in this region. I can tell you that what I felt that day harvesting 300 sockeye. We harvested 300 sockeye the day I was out and got to distribute those to tribal members. And the feeling that I got from that whole experience was something that I have never experienced in my life the entire time I've lived here in the Pacific Northwest. So on a personal level, I could see the impact and see the change in my own life just from being a part of that. And that's what's kind of happening today is many of us that never tasted these fish are getting to taste them again for the first time, and it's really impacting us. And now that they're coming back, we want to figure out how to really bring them back. So it's not just 300 fish to share amongst the tribe, but actually the whole region could potentially benefit from bringing hundreds of thousands of fish back.
If the numbers of fish were in the hundreds of thousands coming into the Spokane area, it would create an industry. It would literally change the economic base of Spokane. You would see everybody from truckers and canners and smokers, everyday people just fishing it. You would have, it would impact the economy substantially. And then also from the tributaries swimming upstream, like out Latah Creek, as far east as Idaho, those people, they'd be able to benefit too. You could go down to your creek and pull some salmon out. Boy, that is unheard of in this area. You know, that's something that generations have lost, and it would impact everybody. It really would. It would become, I think it would become a real primary food source. I think we would move more from like fish, or not from fish, but from like beef, red meats, more towards fish, more towards salmon, because it'd be so available, and the price of it would come down substantially.
Having hundreds of thousands of fish back in the Spokane River is literally changing the family dynamics of our community. Our families are becoming stronger, our health is becoming stronger. It is literally changing everything about our community based on our food source, based on the fish, and based on tradition.
What would change?
Well, I think that the focus on ecology would be a lot greater. We'd have a lot more funding for preservation and just the whole ecosystem, preserving the whole ecosystem for not only the fish, but when you bring fish in, you also bring their natural predators, and you also bring in other species that are that cohabitate with the fish. And those are some of the things that you have to take into account when you're looking at that. But I think as a whole, I think our state would be, I think it would be a whole different thing. I mean, it's hard for me to explain.
Well, the ecosystem has completely changed with the return of the salmon. Basically, the salmon feeds everything in the entire food chain, from the bottom to the top. It's one of the rare species that actually do that. So it feeds us, the top predators, the bears. We actually had grizzly bears here on the Spokane River at the Spokane Falls. But the black bears, we do have around. In fact, I live out on Lake Spokane, and we do have a black bear that lives right behind my house. So they do come and they pull those carcasses up into the forest, as do the otters, as do a number of small mammals. So they're returning those nutrients to the forest, and that's what gives the Pacific Northwest its great forests and its huge trees, is the salmon protein and phosphorus that comes up these river systems and replenishes our forest. And then, you know, on top of that, even the small salmon fry themselves feed on the decomposing bodies of their elders. So you've got the microorganisms feeding on the decaying bodies, all the way up to whole fish feeding large carnivores. So this animal is literally feeding the entire food chain of the Pacific Northwest. And as this fish has come back, you see the ecosystem rebounding in higher numbers of all these organisms. So we're having nothing but incredible benefits to the entire region by bringing these fish back. I'm actually going to sit down with an 84-year-old elder, and she has never seen a salmon, a Spokane, you know, a living, she's seen salmon, but not one up the Spokane system. So when you try to ask her, she actually has no memories. But what she can talk about is what we're talking about now, how it could change her life as it stands. So the sad thing is what the elders that we have left actually don't have a lot of salmon stories in the Spokane tribe, whereas if you go out to the Pacific coastal tribes, they actually have, you could ask and you could get a handful of stories right now. I guarantee 2 generations ago, we would have had that same handful of stories. But with the loss of the fish, it just goes to show you lose that loss of tradition, that loss of storytelling. Our entire culture falls to the wayside just by the loss of the number one protein, the number one food source that brought us all together.
When you look back, it was in the 30s that the Grand Coulee was built, and that's when that's when we lost the salmon in this area. And if you take that time span, that would put, if it was 35, 36 around that area, we're in 2011 now, so we're talking 75 years old. Somebody would have to be, they would have had to been born then, so they would have to have been, to remember something like that, 80, 85, 90 years old to remember something like that, and there's not a whole lot of those elders around anymore. Not really.
From our initial conversation, she doesn't feel like she has a lot of knowledge, and she was a little apprehensive about wanting to talk about salmon because she didn't feel like she had the knowledge. And so that just goes to show why it's so important to talk to these elders, because even what they don't know is so important for us to understand our history.
Well, there's not a whole lot that, you could talk to some of the other elders around, but they would all be pretty much secondhand stories. Sure. Oh, well, I'd like to talk a little bit about the eel. Yeah, with the return of the salmon, you would have the return of the eel. Hopefully, at some point. That, and I know eels were considered a delicatessen. They were something that was hard to come by, and they were served with freshwater mussels and the salmon too. But I definitely like to see more abundant eels, only because it's one of those things that when it's gone, it's gone. Bringing it back would be next to impossible.
Well, the eel is a great example of, when we talk about salmon, we often forget the other species. The salmon is not the only creature that lives in these river systems and that's impacted by these dams and the change in the ecosystem. We've got the massive sturgeon that is an incredible prehistoric animal that still lives in these waters. And what's amazing about the eel is that it is the most protein-rich source of food on the planet. In fact, a 1.5 pound eel has more protein and micronutrients, I guess, than a 30-pound salmon. It's freaking 7 years in the river before it gets to the ocean.
Wow.
And it starts about yay big, and it keeps gradually growing, and it feeds on, God damn it, how does it work? I think it feeds on the rotting salmon carcasses the whole time it's in this juvenile stage. That's what it is. So for 7 years, the lamprey depends on the food provided by the salmon, and then it goes to the ocean for 2 years, and it relies on the salmon to feed it. You see what I'm saying? So they're totally dependent on each other, and it's just at different points in their life cycle that they feed off one another.
Wow.
See what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. It's pretty incredible.
That is. That's weird. I hadn't heard anybody that knows as much about eel as you.
Well, the elder from the Nez Perce tribe, that's the eel expert. He's just an incredible wealth of knowledge on eel. It's so cool. They're just the coolest critters. Just imagine how they would stick to certain rocks back in the day. You'd go to certain places to harvest them because they would stick their mouths to that certain surfaces and on certain water flow. So under those certain conditions, literally hundreds and thousands would congregate on these certain rocks, and they would go and collect them off those certain rocks, these certain sacred collection spots.
I heard that they used to send the young girls into the water and the eels to attract the eels.
Huh?
And they would stick to their legs, and they would. That's how they would get it. One way they would get it.
Oh, how cool!
I don't know how cool that was for the girl.
So the eel was such an important food source to the ancestors because it brought an amazing wealth of those nutrients and proteins from the ocean, and they used to return at the hundreds of millions. So, what a great thing to bring up and a great animal to think about, in that as we recover the salmon, we can recover so many other species that aren't necessarily those beautiful, charismatic creatures that are picture perfect. Even animals like the eel, who are slippery and slimy and thought to be like snakes, even though they have a massively important role in the ecosystem, are going to benefit from the return of the salmon. So it's just a win-win on so many levels for the ecosystem to bring these fish back.